Colonel Sarah Mitchell walked into the war room with her head held high, despite the whispers that followed her everywhere she went. At 28, she was the youngest person ever to hold such a high rank in the military, and she had earned it through blood, sweat, and countless sleepless nights on the battlefield. The war room was filled with smoke from cigarettes and the tension of men who had been fighting this war for 3 long years. Maps covered every wall, marked with red pins showing enemy positions and blue pins showing their own forces. The smell of strong coffee mixed with the metallic scent of weapons that had been cleaned and recleaned. Sarah took her place at the large wooden table that dominated the center of the room. Around her sat 12 of the most experienced military officers in the country. Their faces were weathered from years of combat, their eyes hard from seeing too much death and destruction. Most of them were old enough to be her father, and some had been fighting wars since before she was even born. General Harrison, a man with gray hair and deep wrinkles around his eyes, was explaining the latest intelligence reports when Sarah arrived. He paused briefly to acknowledge her presence with a slight nod, then continued speaking about enemy movements near the Eastern Front. "Our scouts report that the enemy has moved 3 divisions closer to the river crossing," Harrison said, pointing to a spot on the map with his wooden stick. "We need to decide whether to engage them head-on or try to outflank them through the mountain pass." The other officers began discussing strategies, their voices growing louder as they debated the best course of action. Some wanted to attack immediately, while others preferred a more cautious approach. Sarah listened carefully, taking notes and studying the maps, but she remained silent. Lieutenant Colonel Jenkins, a stocky man with a thick mustache, slammed his fist on the table. "We should hit them hard and fast," he declared. "No point in waiting around for them to get stronger." "That's suicide," argued Major Thompson, shaking his head. "We don't have enough ammunition for a full assault. We need to be smart about this." The debate continued for nearly an hour, with no clear consensus emerging. Finally, General Harrison turned to Sarah, who had been quietly analyzing the situation from her corner of the table. "Colonel Mitchell," he said, "you've been unusually quiet today. What's your assessment of the situation?" All eyes turned to Sarah as she stood up slowly. She walked over to the large map on the wall and studied it for a moment before speaking. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice steady and confident, "I believe we're looking at this all wrong. We're so focused on where the enemy is now that we're not thinking about where they want to be." She pointed to a different area on the map, several miles south of where the enemy forces were currently positioned. "If I were commanding their forces, I wouldn't be planning to cross at the river. I'd be using those 3 divisions as a distraction while I moved my main force here," she said, tapping the map with her finger. "There's an old bridge that was damaged in the bombing last month, but our intelligence reports suggest it's been repaired." Several officers leaned forward to get a better look at the area Sarah was indicating. Major Peterson, an older man with kind eyes, nodded thoughtfully. "That would explain why their movements seemed so obvious," he said. "Usually, they're much more careful about concealing their positions." Sarah continued her analysis, explaining how the enemy's apparent mistakes were actually calculated moves designed to draw their attention away from their real objective. Her reasoning was logical and well supported by the available evidence. However, not everyone in the room was impressed by her strategic thinking. Captain Reynolds, a man known for his traditional views and resistance to change, had been growing increasingly uncomfortable with Sarah's presence in what he considered a man's domain. Reynolds had served in the military for over 20 years, starting as a young recruit and working his way up through the ranks. He came from a family where military service was a tradition passed down from father to son for generations. The idea of taking orders from a woman, especially one young enough to be his daughter, went against everything he believed about the natural order of things. As Sarah concluded her presentation and returned to her seat, Reynolds cleared his throat loudly. The room fell silent as everyone turned to look at him. He had a reputation for speaking his mind, regardless of whether his opinions were popular or appropriate. "That's all very interesting, Colonel," Reynolds said, his voice dripping with barely concealed sarcasm. "But I have to wonder about something." Sarah looked at him calmly, waiting for him to continue. She had dealt with men like Reynolds before, and she knew that showing any sign of weakness or defensiveness would only encourage him. "I'm curious," Reynolds continued, leaning back in his chair with a smug expression on his face. About your qualifications for giving strategic advice. You see, most of us in this room have been in actual combat situations. We've faced enemy fire, made life-and-death decisions under pressure, and lost good men under our command. The tension in the room became thick enough to cut with a knife. Several officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing that Reynolds was about to cross a line that shouldn't be crossed. "So I'm wondering," Reynolds said, his voice getting louder and more mocking, "what exactly is your kill count, Colonel? How many enemy soldiers have you personally eliminated in combat? Because that's what really matters in war, isn't it? Results, not theories." The room erupted in uncomfortable murmurs. Some officers looked shocked at Reynolds' blunt question, while others seemed curious about how Sarah would respond. General Harrison opened his mouth to intervene, but Sarah raised her hand slightly, indicating that she would handle the situation herself. The question hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Reynolds sat back with a satisfied smile, clearly believing that he had cornered the young colonel and exposed her as an inexperienced officer who had risen through the ranks based on politics rather than merit. Sarah stood up slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. She looked directly at Reynolds, her green eyes never wavering from his face. The silence in the room was complete except for the distant sound of artillery fire from the front lines. What happened next would change everything in that war room, and the story of Sarah's response would be told and retold for years to come. But first, to understand the full impact of her words, one needed to know the complete truth about Colonel Sarah Mitchell's past, a truth that was about to shock every person in that room. Reynolds had no idea what he had just unleashed, or how dramatically his mocking question was about to backfire. The young colonel he had tried to humiliate was about to reveal a side of herself that would silence not just him, but every person who heard her story. The stage was set for a revelation that would forever change how these battle-hardened veterans viewed their youngest colleague. Sarah Mitchell was about to show them exactly why she had earned her rank, and why her kill count was something that should never have been questioned in the first place. Sarah Mitchell looked around the room at the faces of the men who were waiting for her answer. Some seemed embarrassed by Reynolds' crude question, while others appeared genuinely curious about her combat experience. She could feel the weight of their expectations and judgments pressing down on her shoulders. She walked slowly to the window that overlooked the base courtyard. Through the glass, she could see young soldiers training, their movements sharp and precise as they practiced combat drills. The sight reminded her of another time, another place, where she had learned lessons that these men could never imagine. "You want to know about my kill count, Captain Reynolds?" Sarah said quietly, her back still turned to the room. "That's an interesting question." She turned around to face the room, and the officers could see that her expression had changed completely. The confident military bearing was still there, but now there was something else in her eyes, something dark and haunting that made several of the men shift uncomfortably in their chairs. "Before I answer that question," Sarah continued, "let me tell you about a little girl named Sarah who lived in a small village called Greenfield Valley. This village was nestled in the mountains, about 200 miles from here. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's name, where children played in the streets without fear, and where the biggest worry was whether the harvest would be good enough to last through winter." Major Peterson frowned slightly, wondering why the colonel was talking about her childhood when they were supposed to be discussing military strategy. But something in her tone made him listen carefully. "Sarah was 8 years old when the war came to Greenfield Valley," she continued. "The enemy forces moved through the mountains faster than anyone expected. The villagers had maybe 6 hours of warning before the soldiers arrived." General Harrison realized where this story was heading, and his face grew pale. He had read Sarah's file, but the details had been classified at the highest levels. Most of the officers in this room had no idea about her background. "The villagers tried to evacuate," Sarah said, her voice remaining steady despite the pain that was clearly visible in her eyes. "But there wasn't enough time, and there wasn't anywhere to go. The mountain passes were already blocked by enemy forces." She walked back to the map on the wall and pointed to a spot in the northern mountains. The enemy soldiers entered Greenfield Valley on a Tuesday morning in early spring. They were looking for resistance fighters who they believed were hiding in the area. They searched every house, every barn, every cellar. When they couldn't find the fighters they were looking for, they decided to make an example of the village. The room was completely silent now. Even Reynolds had stopped smirking and was listening intently to every word. They gathered all the villagers in the town square, Sarah continued. 347 people, men, women, children, even the elderly who could barely walk. They lined them up in rows and told them that 10 villagers would be executed for every resistance fighter who didn't surrender. Major Thompson felt sick to his stomach. He had heard stories about enemy atrocities, but hearing them told in such a personal way by someone who had lived through them was different. Little Sarah watched from her hiding place in the church bell tower as the soldiers started counting down from 10. Her father had hidden her there when the soldiers first arrived, telling her not to come out no matter what she heard. Sarah's voice began to crack slightly, but she forced herself to continue. When they reached 0, the shooting started. Sarah watched through a crack in the wooden boards as 30 villagers fell to the ground. Her mother was among them, her teacher, her best friend's father, people she had known her entire life. General Harrison closed his eyes, remembering the classified reports he had read about the Greenfield Valley massacre. It had been one of the worst atrocities committed during the early years of the war. The soldiers gave the villagers another chance to reveal the location of the resistance fighters. Again, no one spoke up because there were no resistance fighters in Greenfield Valley. It had always been a peaceful farming community. Sarah turned away from the map and looked directly at Reynolds, who was no longer making eye contact with her. The second round of executions claimed 40 more lives. Sarah's father was among them, so was her little brother, who was only 5 years old. Lieutenant Colonel Jenkins felt his hands beginning to tremble. He had seen plenty of combat, but the thought of a child witnessing such horror was almost unbearable. By the time the soldiers finished, 212 villagers were dead. The survivors were forced to bury the bodies in a mass grave outside the town. 8-year-old Sarah climbed down from the bell tower after the soldiers left and helped dig that grave with her bare hands. Sarah paused for a moment, taking a deep breath before continuing with the most difficult part of her story. But the soldiers didn't leave permanently. They set up a garrison in the village and used it as a base for operations in the surrounding area. The remaining villagers were essentially prisoners, forced to work as slaves to support the enemy forces. She walked over to her chair and sat down, but her eyes never left Reynolds' face. Sarah spent the next 4 years in that occupied village. 4 years of watching the enemy soldiers abuse and murder the remaining villagers. 4 years of hiding in basements and attics, scrounging for food, and learning to move through the shadows like a ghost. Major Peterson was beginning to understand where this story was leading, and he felt a chill run down his spine. When Sarah turned 12, she made a decision. She decided that she was going to kill every enemy soldier in Greenfield Valley, and then she was going to hunt down every enemy soldier she could find for the rest of her life. The room was so quiet that the officers could hear their own heartbeats. Everyone was staring at Sarah, trying to process what she was telling them. She started small: a kitchen knife stolen from the garrison mess hall, a loose board in the floor of the old blacksmith shop, a rope taken from the stable. Sarah began killing enemy soldiers one by one, making it look like accidents or natural causes. Reynolds felt sweat beginning to form on his forehead. He was starting to realize that his mocking question had opened a door that should have remained closed. She poisoned their water supply with berries from the toxic nightshade plant that grew wild in the mountains. She loosened the wheels on their supply wagons so they would crash on the mountain roads. She set fires in their barracks while they slept. She used every trick and trap she could think of. Sarah's voice was completely emotionless now, as if she were reading from a military report rather than recounting her own traumatic experiences. By the time Sarah turned 16, she had personally killed 37 enemy soldiers, but she was just getting started. The implications of what Sarah was saying began to sink in for everyone in the room. Captain Reynolds, in particular, was beginning to understand that his casual question about kill count had touched on something far more serious than he had ever imagined. Sarah looked around the room at each officer in turn, her green eyes reflecting a hardness that came from years of unimaginable experiences. That 16-year-old girl joined the resistance fighters when they finally arrived in Greenfield Valley. She became their most effective scout and assassin. She could move through enemy territory like a shadow, strike without warning, and disappear before anyone knew what had happened. General Harrison knew that the classified portions of Sarah's file contained details that would shock even these experienced military officers. Her teenage years had been spent in operations that were so dangerous and so morally complex that they were never discussed in official reports. The story was far from over, and the revelation of Sarah's true kill count was still to come. But already, the atmosphere in the war room had changed completely. Reynolds' mocking question had unleashed something that none of them had been prepared for. Sarah Mitchell was not the inexperienced young officer that some of them had assumed her to be. She was something far more dangerous and far more valuable than any of them had realized. And her answer to Reynolds' question was going to change everything they thought they knew about warfare, about survival, and about the true cost of the conflict they were all fighting. Sarah stood up again and walked to the center of the room. The officers could see that telling her story had taken an emotional toll on her, but her military composure remained intact. She looked directly at Captain Reynolds, who was now avoiding her gaze entirely. "You asked about my kill count, Captain," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Let me give you the complete answer." She moved to the blackboard that hung on the wall behind General Harrison's chair and picked up a piece of chalk. With deliberate strokes, she began writing numbers. Greenfield Valley Garrison, 37 confirmed kills over 4 years, all close range, all personal. She wrote the number 37 on the board. The room remained dead silent as she continued. Resistance operations in the mountain region, 63 confirmed kills over 2 years. Sniper operations, explosives, hand-to-hand combat. She added 63 to the board. Major Thompson felt his mouth go dry. He had never heard of a single person, let alone someone who started as a child, accumulating such numbers. Special operations missions in the Eastern Territories, 49 confirmed kills over 18 months, deep reconnaissance, target elimination, extraction operations. The number 49 appeared on the board. Sarah turned back to face the room, the chalk still in her hand. Urban warfare operations in the capital city siege, 91 confirmed kills over 8 months. Building-to-building fighting, counter-sniper operations, explosive ordnance disposal under fire. She wrote 91 on the board. General Harrison watched as the faces of his officers grew increasingly pale. Even he had not known the complete extent of Sarah's combat record. The classified files had contained only summaries. Northern Front breakthrough operations, 115 confirmed kills over 6 months. These were the operations that earned me my first field commission. The number 115 joined the others. Lieutenant Colonel Jenkins stared at the growing list of numbers on the blackboard. Each figure represented more combat experience than most soldiers accumulated in their entire careers. Desert Campaign reconnaissance missions, 72 confirmed kills over 4 months. Long-range patrol operations, survival situations, resource denial missions. She added 72 to the list. Sarah set the chalk down on the ledge beneath the blackboard and turned to face Captain Reynolds directly. "Now we come to the most recent operations," she said. "The ones that led to my promotion to colonel and my assignment to this command." She picked up the chalk again and resumed writing. Operation Ghost Walker, 86 confirmed kills over 2 weeks. Solo infiltration of enemy headquarters complex. Elimination of high-value targets, destruction of communication systems, intelligence gathering. The number 86 appeared on the board. Operation Silent Thunder, 103 confirmed kills over 10 days. Defense of strategic bridge position against overwhelming enemy forces. Held position for 72 hours with no support. She wrote 103. Captain Reynolds felt sick to his stomach. He had spent his entire military career training for combat situations, but he had never personally killed more than a dozen enemy soldiers. The numbers on the blackboard represented a level of combat experience that was almost beyond comprehension. Operation Dark Angel, 127 confirmed kills over 5 days. Rescue mission for captured intelligence officers. Penetrated enemy prison compound, extracted targets, eliminated pursuit forces. The number 127 was added to the growing list. Sarah put the chalk down and walked back to the center of the room. Every eye was fixed on her as she prepared to deliver the final count. "In total, Captain Reynolds, My confirmed kill count stands at 743 enemy soldiers eliminated in direct combat operations. She picked up the chalk one final time and wrote the number 743 at the bottom of the list, underlining it twice. The silence in the room was complete and absolute. Several officers were staring at the blackboard as if they couldn't believe what they were seeing. Others were looking at Sarah with a mixture of awe and something approaching fear. "But you asked me specifically about my kill count," Sarah continued, "so let me be completely accurate in my answer." She walked back to the blackboard and wrote another number below the total. Unconfirmed kills from explosive devices, structural collapses, vehicle accidents, and other indirect methods, estimated at 218 additional enemy casualties. The final number she wrote was 961. So to answer your question directly, Captain Reynolds, my personal kill count is 961 confirmed and probable enemy eliminations over a combat career spanning 12 years. Sarah set the chalk down with deliberate care and turned back to face the room. The officers sat in stunned silence, trying to process what they had just learned. Captain Reynolds looked as if he had been physically struck. His face was pale and his hands were trembling slightly. The mocking confidence he had displayed earlier had completely evaporated. "Every single one of those numbers represents a human being who was trying to kill me or my fellow soldiers," Sarah said quietly. "Every single death was necessary to complete a mission or protect innocent lives. Every single kill was confirmed by military intelligence and recorded in my official service record." She walked back to her chair and sat down, her movements calm and controlled despite the emotional weight of what she had just revealed. "I didn't seek out killing, gentlemen. It sought me out when I was 8 years old and watched my family murdered in front of my eyes. I became very good at it because my survival and the survival of others depended on it." General Harrison cleared his throat and spoke for the first time since Sarah had begun her story. "Colonel Mitchell's complete service record is classified at the highest levels," he said. "What she has shared with us today is information that very few people in the military have clearance to access." Major Peterson found his voice and asked the question that everyone was thinking. "Colonel, how is it possible for one person to accumulate such combat statistics and still be functional?" Sarah looked at him with something that might have been appreciation for asking an honest question, instead of making crude jokes. "Major, I stopped being a normal person the day my family was murdered. I became a weapon that was pointed at the enemy and fired repeatedly for over a decade. The fact that I can still function in polite society is something that surprises my psychological evaluators on a regular basis." She looked around the room at each officer in turn. "But I want to be very clear about something. Every enemy soldier I killed was actively engaged in combat operations against our forces or civilian populations. I have never killed anyone who wasn't trying to kill me or innocent people. I have never used my skills for personal gain or revenge outside of legitimate military operations." Captain Reynolds finally managed to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "Colonel, I owe you an apology. I had no idea." Sarah held up her hand to stop him. "Captain, you owe me nothing. You asked a legitimate question about combat experience. I answered it honestly. What you do with that information is up to you." She stood up and walked back to the map on the wall. "Now, gentlemen, if we're finished discussing personal history, I believe we have a war to fight. My analysis of the enemy's likely objectives remains the same, regardless of how many people I've killed in previous operations." The officers slowly began to refocus their attention on the strategic situation, but the atmosphere in the room had changed permanently. They were no longer looking at Sarah Mitchell as a young woman who had been promoted beyond her experience level. They were looking at her as perhaps the most lethal combat veteran any of them had ever encountered. Reynolds sat quietly for the rest of the meeting, his earlier arrogance completely deflated. He had learned a lesson about making assumptions that he would never forget. As the meeting concluded and the officers filed out of the room, Sarah remained behind to study the maps more carefully. General Harrison approached her as the last of the other officers left. "Sarah," he said quietly, "you didn't have to share all of that. Your service record speaks for itself." Sarah looked up from the map and gave him a tired smile. "General, sometimes the only way to stop people from asking stupid questions is to give them answers they can't handle. Captain Reynolds won't question my qualifications again." Harrison nodded and walked toward the door. As he reached it, he turned back. "For what it's worth, Colonel, those numbers on the blackboard represent more than just kills. They represent lives saved, missions accomplished, and strategic objectives achieved. Your country owes you a debt that can never be repaid." Sarah looked back at the blackboard where the numbers still remained. 961. Each one a story, a decision, a moment when she had chosen to pull the trigger instead of hesitating. "General," she said softly, "I just want this war to end so that some other 8-year-old girl doesn't have to learn the things I learned." After Harrison left, Sarah erased the blackboard carefully, removing all trace of the numbers that had silenced the war room. But the memory of what those numbers represented would stay with every officer who had heard them for the rest of their lives. Captain Reynolds would never again question the qualifications of a fellow officer based on their age or gender. He had learned that experience comes in many forms, and that the quiet ones often have the most dangerous stories to tell. The war room returned to normal operations the next day, but everyone who had been present for Sarah's revelation treated her with a new level of respect and caution. They had asked about her kill count and learned that some questions are better left unasked.